This is actually a very special class for me. And it's not because of the class itself, although Melinda's a fantastic instructor. It's all about the people who are leading this class. I am in the process of buying a condo, and True View Inspections did my inspection, and Melinda is doing my title services. And that's why this class is so special to me. And I must say that I have been taken very well care of. And I can assure you, if I'm giving the endorsement, it's because of their care and everything that they've showed me to make this process as easy and smoothly as possible. I know sometimes I'm busy and they're having to deal with my tardiness, but they're patient. They're very thorough and detailed people. And I just cannot thank the both of them enough, with True View Home Inspections and Grimaldi Law for all the help that they've given me so far. So with it being 1:02, we're going to go ahead and get started. Katie is in the room. She is with True View Home Inspections, or True View Inspections. And Katie, please tell us about all the wonderful things that True View is doing. Obviously, they provide a lot of services, and I was even impressed with my inspection. I won't go into too much detail about it because I know you can pitch it way better. So tell them, all of the amazing things that you offer and what separates yourself from the rest of the inspection services.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you. So it was a pleasure, absolute pleasure of doing the inspection for your own personal property. And just like you just said it's so important in this industry to make sure that you're working with companies that you can lean on, that is going to represent you as the buyer's agent well. You as the title agent representing the buyer's agent well, right? So every little aspect of the real estate transaction works together in a very positive way. And that's because you have to choose companies that you can count on and that have good reputations and are going to go above and beyond, not just for you as an agent, but for your home buyers as well. So let's start. We service Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County. And what makes us a little different is, one, we have immediate report delivery. And more than ever, time is of the essence in these transactions. And you want to make sure that you work with a company that can not only get you scheduled fast, but knows that you're going to get that report on the spot before the inspector even leaves the property. That's extremely important. Number two, our reports come with HD pictures and videos. You could ask Kevin. We take great detailed videos in all the reports, and it adds a lot of value and gives a true understanding of the condition of their property at the time of the inspection. And number three, if you haven't used this before, we do have a 200% satisfaction guarantee. So for whatever reason, you and your buyers are not satisfied within 24 hours of receiving that report, they're not only going to refund your money, but we're going to go ahead and pay for a subsequent inspection. So we do have an online scheduler available to you 24/7. It has a little promo code that can save your clients some money as well. And I'm going to go ahead and drop our website and our phone number in the chat. If you have any questions, I'll stick around for just a few. And we would love the opportunity to help you in your next transaction and get this home inspection done for your buyers.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and add to that. What was really amazing about True View is if the condo that I'm looking to live in, we didn't know where the condensers were. And of course, instead of being like, well, we just can't find them, well, it's too bad, he had a pretty good idea that the condenser might actually be on the roof. So he actively looked for a way to get onto the roof safely, which he did. And he went up there and he found the condenser. He got the information I needed. It was replaced in 2017, so I'm in pretty good shape there.
Okay, nice.
And it was also nice to see. Like with the little damages and the little things that you would hope to get fixed. Now in this market, a lot of listing agents and owners are like, "And what? You're going to take it or leave it?" But if this market ever closes down, it's actually a fantastic negotiating tool for you to say, like, "Hey, there's clearly some mold growing here. I would like for you to provide us a credit so that we can fix this problem." And so hopefully as the market calms down a little bit, these are some things that you'll be able to utilize with True View. But for the meantime, it's usually a take it or leave it situation. I don't anticipate it being like this forever. And the services that True View provides you makes it so much easier for you to have what you need at the negotiating table. And if you want an excellent negotiator, our next instructor, Melinda Grimaldi, is probably one of the best in the business. She obviously knows the contracts. She obviously knows the ins and outs of it so that you are not caught in a bad situation where you left a box unchecked and everything else. We understand that contracts can be a little dry, But Melinda does a fantastic job of making it entertaining, and she is knowledgeable and in a way to deliver the information to where it just doesn't fly over your head. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce Melinda Grimaldi. Thank you so much for coming on the program and teaching our class today. The floor is yours.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kevin, for that wonderful introduction. I'm glad to see the room filled up and we're ready to get crack-a-lackin' for today. Not your average contract class, because that I titled it that because I'm not going to go and read you every single line. I will go through and read a few of the lines to make sure you guys understand them, but I will break it down into the simplest form that I can, into little bite-sized pieces, and really help you understand it enough that you can guide your clients in the right direction. So let me share my screen. I will say I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and let me just open it up right here. So if you guys have questions, please don't hesitate to jump in the chat and ask questions as we go along, and let's get started. So here I am. That's me, Melinda Grimaldi. I'm a real estate and title attorney. I have my law firm. I have my title company, Grimaldi Law Firm, the Closers and Title Insurance Agency. We do it all. We do it really great. I think Kevin gave me, it can't get better than the intro that he gave me. So I'm just going to move into the goals of the workshop, because at the end of the day, you have to always start with a goal. And so even in a class, like, what is your goal for this class? The goal for you should be to have a better grip and be able to better explain the process, the contract as you're going through it with your clients. What is the differences between the different check the boxes, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to learn all the as is issues, the updates, because there's been a lot of changes, hotspots, landmines to ensure you prepare or review offers like a pro for your clients. And then, of course, there's been recent changes. They happened in November. The forms now have been updated. So anything you see in the form simplicity or any of the form builders that you're going to be using moving forward will have the new form. So if you were very familiar with the old form, I will give you the comparison. If not, you'll hear about the changes to be able to understand the current assessment of the as-is contract as we stand. So let's get straight into it. We're going to be using the as-is contract as the base. However, I will be referencing the standard contract as we go along if there's big differences, okay? So what does that mean? There's two FAR contracts that we use in Florida. One is the as-is, and one has required seller repairs. That's the biggest difference. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But first and foremost, at the bottom of every contract, you see it's highlighted in red here towards the bottom, Florida Realtors, Florida Bar -6 revised 1021. So this is the most recent version. That's how you know you're working for the most recent version. It also tells you what type of contract, because the FAR bar is not the only one. There's regional forms, there's custom contracts, there's commercial contracts. But like I said, the most often what we see in South Florida is going to be the as-is. That's, I would say 95% of the contracts we see are the as-is contracts. Another little tip, on the left-hand side, there's numbers going from 1 through 52. You'll see some of them are starred. I don't know if you know this, but it's starred because there's a blank on that line. That means that you need to fill something out or check a box or put in a number. Okay, so use that as before you submit that offer, double check your lines, go through it one by one where it started, and make sure you filled it in. My preference is to not leave blanks. I like to, even if you're going to keep the default, type in the default. It makes for a cleaner contract. All right, so let's move along. The parties to a contract, like the first page of the contract, just in and of itself sets the pace of the contract. You need to make sure you have the right sellers. You need to make sure you spell the names correctly. I know I'm saying this and it kind of sounds like, of course, we need to put the right names, right? But I can't tell you how many times we get contracts that come through our desk with the wrong name. So I'm going to tell you how to make sure you have the right name for the sellers and the buyers moving forward. But a little tip here of what's changed. Okay, in the personal property section, you'll see there's things in blue. Those things in blue are the things that have changed since the most recent revisions. So what has been included with the sale of a property is thermostats, doorbells, television wall mounts, TV mounting hardware, mailbox key, which has been a point of contention at some of these closings. So if there is a mailbox key, make sure your seller has it ready to be delivered to the buyer. Storm protection items and hardware. They deleted intercoms because I guess everyone's using Alexa nowadays and there's no real formal intercoms being used. But what's still not included is the washer and dryer. So if you have a buyer who thinks they're going to get the washer and dryer at closing, I've seen this happen before. There's been standoffs for washer and dryers. So make sure you add it in and anything else the buyer wants. The legal description is something that you're going to pull from public records. We have the property address, of course, and the next slide here, it goes a little bit more into that. So here you'll see a screen clip. This happens to be Broward County, but they all have similar fields like this. Is a screen clip of a property appraiser site, and it shows the property owner, the mailing address, the abbreviated legal. That's not the full legal. This is at minimum, you should be adding the abbreviated legal in there for the legal address, but you can't rely on the property appraiser's site for the seller's name. And here's why. First and foremost, this particular file here has a typo in the seller's name, which is correct in the deed. So I just happen to know this was a file that we worked on not too long ago. We did a closing on. So there's a typo here. You see, it's supposed to be McDaniel and they put McDonnelly or McDonnell. So, make sure that you look at the prior deed, not only for the proper spelling, but you see towards property owner towards the end, there's the 4-letter word ETAL. Etal. That's a Latin term which basically in English is there's more that doesn't fit in this line. So you guys got to look at the deed because there's more sellers than the people that are listed here, and there's not enough room on the property appraiser's template. Okay, so you got to pull it up. Think about it, if you have a listing agreement and you don't have all the sellers on your listing agreement. What if one decides to change, doesn't want to use you, right? You could be working on a file for nothing. So whether it's the listing agreement, the contract, and of course all title documents later, we need to make sure we have all the sellers listed. Speaking of sellers, if they are foreign, a little reminder, if they are not, and foreign meaning not US taxpayers, we need to determine if they're foreign as soon as possible. If it's your listing, you should be asking that question in your intake. There's a really funny reel right now that's talking about the intake, are you married? Yes or no? Why not? And if you guys look at those questions, it's a really funny reel. I'll have to share it to you guys later. But with that, it's a reminder that proper intake really makes for a clean contract, a clean transaction. So make sure, and for buyers, you want to make sure the name that you use on the offer matches their ID. Why? The lender is going to put the loan on a name based on their ID. In South Florida, especially with some of these Latin that have like 2 middle names, 2 last names, it must match exactly the ID. Because if it doesn't, then we're going to have a problem later trying to notarize documents because the name's not going to match the name on the document. Okay. So I know it's a very simple thing, but if you start off wrong, then if you work with us, we're going to say, hey, we need an addendum because the IDs don't match. Hey, you're going to need an addendum. You don't have all the sellers. Let's make it clean. Let's make you look like a pro to your clients, that you have a clean contract going in, clean contract coming out. All right, property description. We already referenced this a little bit. We're going to use you could use the full legal on the recorded deed, or you could use the abbreviated from the deed, but abbreviated from the property appraiser. Either way, make sure that you're using the full address on the property appraiser site and the tax identification number. One little number off can create confusion in what property it is, and then we order title on the wrong property. All right. Should all be familiar with this. Not too complicated here. You list the escrow agent information right in the middle. If you're gonna do something manual, or if your program doesn't do the math, guys, make sure the math is right. Let's make sure we don't have problems with our contract right from the beginning because you don't have the math right. But most importantly, the escrow agent's information, whether it's a lawyer, a law firm, a title company, a brokerage, that doesn't mean that's who's going to be doing the closing. That just means who's holding the funds. If there's a change later, we could do an addendum. Now, I hear this all the time. Yeah, but the seller scratched it off and put their attorney's name, or the seller scratched it off and put their title company's name. That doesn't matter. That's just who's holding escrow. That's not what's going to force you to use a certain closing agent or not. So I hear that a lot. So I wanted to make sure that I clarified that in this class. In some parts of Florida, seller is choosing the title company. If that's a part, or if that's something that's negotiated later, or if that's something that you want to have be the scenario in your deal, you want to disclose who the closing agent will be, so that they have the escrow agent information. Because the reality is, if I'm not doing the escrow, if I'm not doing the closing, why am I going to hold escrow? It's just going to delay time for funds to be transferred from one place to another, unless the buyer specifically wants their attorney to hold the escrow. So disclosing that up front is very helpful. The amount of the deposit to put in, that's up to negotiation, right? But obviously seller wants more, buyer wants less. In this market, highest and best, right? We're hearing that every day. If it's an as is, try it, and your buyer is a little squeamish about putting so much up front, you could split it into two. Put a little bit up front after the inspection period is completed, your buyer is going forward. That's when you could put the higher amount later. Okay, within 10 days or whatever amount of days you put it. In cooler markets, you're able to negotiate this a little bit more. Once, who are you getting the escrow letter from? You're going to get the escrow letter from whoever was listed on page 1. If you're going to be including additional items over and above what's listed as a default, remember we went here with the default of what's included in section D. If you're going to, like, for example, be selling or helping a client buy a furnished property, it's super, super important you have a detailed list. We don't want a conflict later at the walkthrough saying, wait, you took this piece, I thought I was keeping it, etc. Consider taking photos, itemized, addendum to the contract to include exactly what's supposed to be there. Sometimes, having both agents go to the property and just listing them out might be the way to do it, or using pictures. We mentioned already who can serve as an escrow agent: real estate brokers, insurers, licensed title agents, attorneys, financial institutions in some cases, depending. If you are a broker serving as the escrow agent, know that you are also subject to rules imposed by the DBPR and FREC, in addition to the contract itself. Acceptance and effective date. I feel like there's been a huge problem recently with the effective date and agents submitting clean contracts. And what does that mean? We don't have an effective date if we're missing a rider that was checked off. We don't have an effective date if there's one initial missing. We don't have an effective date if a signature is missing. We don't have an effective date if the rider was included but not fully filled out, or initials missing on the rider. Guys, the effective date is what starts all the timelines. If you don't have a fully executed contract, either party can walk. Because what's going to be the first thing that happens when there's a conflict? They're going to hire an attorney. The attorney's going to look at the contract. This is not even fully executed, right? So even with the offers and the counter offers, every scratch off, every addition needs initialed by both parties, even if it doesn't impact them. So before you submit or think you're ready, you need to go through it and check every initial on every page, every initial on every addendum. Did I provide or include every addendum that I checked off? Did we forget a signature? Did we make any additions or amendments or cross-offs, counter-offers? If so, both buyer and seller need to initial that. When contracts come in, that's the first thing we do. Why? Just like you guys, we don't want to let people have an easy way out, right? Because we only get collect at closing, just like you guys. We want to make sure we have an effective contract. It's one of the most important things we have, because otherwise it can get a little difficult and they can want to take the easy way out instead of finishing what they started, especially a seller. And in this market, if you have an ineffective contract, You could very easily go find a cash offer that comes out higher a few days later, and your buyer says, well, goes to their attorney, can I accept this offer? Is the way I can get out? Well, let's see. Let's see what we can do. So super, super important. You want to make sure you're effective, including initials, right? So, but what's the effective date? Once everything's been initialed, once everything's been signed and everything's provided, the effective date is the day that the last missing item, missing initial, missing writer has been obtained, fully signed, and delivered to the other side. So if my client gave me that final initial tonight and I'm sleeping, I won't see it till the morning. Tomorrow morning, I send it to the other side. Tomorrow is the effective date, not today, even though the last initial is today. So you have to be careful because a lot of these softwares that help you e-sign will have it dated for today. But if it doesn't shoot it to the other side automatically, that last date on the offer on the contract is not going to be the effective date. It's actually going to be the next day once it's delivered. And then everything is one day off. So you want to make sure. Okay. I think I beat that one like a dead horse, but it's super important. I'm seeing so many problems with that lately. A change that happened to the contract, they added time is of the essence. It doesn't really change anything, right? To the reality. We all know that time is of the essence. They did change the rollover. So if a deadline falls on a weekend or holiday, it used to roll over to the next business day at 5 o'clock. Well, they removed 5 o'clock, which means you now have until midnight. So that's the change there. It can make or break sometimes a scenario. So, you have that ability. The kickout clause is not going to be something I discuss right now because it's going to deter the whole flow of the presentation, but I will try to, if we have time, I'll get back to that at the end. Does the effective date include the addendum to the contract? If the addendum is is being included as part of the initial offer, then yes. If it's done later on in the contract, let's say after inspection period, there's an addendum for repairs or credit, then no. All right. I see a question here. I just got an offer accepted and the seller wants to use his own attorney and title company for his side of the closing. Is this doable? You got to pay to play is always my response. If the seller wants to pay, then the seller can choose if they want to pay for title insurance, but we'll get to that in closing costs. Remind me again. Okay. All right. Moving along. Closing date. The closing date. There's been some changes to the contract, but I just want you to know that it doesn't really change anything here. You're going to see a lot of different wording, but it doesn't really change. But they wanted you to be aware, okay, that to be able to release keys and be funded, right, requires the closing agent to have all the funds in our account and all the originals. We can't release funds until we have all the funds and until we have all the originals. So don't be that agent that says, when can I come pick up my check? But we haven't even, balanced or done all these different pieces to the puzzle or received originals. Okay. OFAC is a little interesting thing here. Depending on the seller's name, sometimes we send wires, but it could take half a day or more to get the wire out. The wire is removed from my account, but it doesn't clear the bank because due to the seller's name, it's similar to someone who's on a triggered list. As soon as the funds have been released from the account is when we are funded. So just understand that. And that's when keys should be released. There are two ways, speaking of closing date and funding, to extend the closing date that are automatic in the contract if the situation applies. So I'll start with the easier one, force majeure. Force majeure was talked about a lot in 2021 and 2020 when there was the pandemic first starting, right? A lot of people were trying to say, well, is this pandemic a force majeure trigger? Well, it wasn't defined or included in the definition at the time. They have now thereafter included governmental actions and mandates, governmental shutdowns, epidemics, and pandemics. So that has been included in there. However, even if it was included there originally, it does not, it wouldn't have changed the analysis of what happened during COVID, because thankfully to organizations like Miami Association of Realtors and the RPAC and everything that was done, real estate was considered an essential service. Because of that, we were still able to work. That's not the same like in other states where they were shut down entirely and couldn't work. So in Florida, we were still closing every day. So you can't say that that was a force majeure trigger. It has to really stop you from doing such a thing, okay, from doing the closing. So a perfect example is a hurricane. During hurricane season, once we are in the cone of concern, insurance companies stop issuing policies, right, to properties within the cone of concern. Well, in that scenario, loans cannot close without an insurance policy. So that will be per here. That's even listed here. Force majeure means hurricanes, right? It's in there, but it has to stop you from being able to act, right? So just keep that in mind. We can't just use it just because it exists. It has to really stop the transaction from happening. There's also another extension that's related to if there's a loan getting on the property, being taken on the property. The closing date can be extended up to 7 days after the original closing date, should the CD not have been released timely. So what does that even mean? If you're aware or not, I'll give you a little background. Previously, before this rule taking into effect, buyers were showing up to closing and seeing their closing statement for the first time. They were being kind of bullied into certain closing costs. So now lenders are required to disclose certain loan fees, interest rates, etc., to buyers at least 3 business days before closing. Okay, so sometimes if that is not able to be done for whatever technicality, this contract allows them for this automatic extension, and that's how they work through this requirement. So I see a few questions in the chat. Let's talk about some of these I'm going to cover later. Okay, let's talk about the effective date. The buyer's agent used an old lead-based paint form. The next day she sent a new form. What is the effective date? Once that new form is fully executed, initialed, disclosed, and delivered to the other side, that is the effective date. So just keep that in mind. Okay, the other questions will be going through as we go along, and I need to keep this moving because we're already halfway through the hour. A little reminder here that a new rider has been added. I'll show it to you later. It's rider DD, seasonal and vacational rentals. There's so many Airbnb properties and related type of short-term rentals that are going on right now. So it needed to be included if there was a property being subject to a lease after closing. So this is where you check off if there is if there's a lease where the tenant is going to be staying after closing. It should be disclosed on the MLS. If it's your listing, put it on there. If it's your listing and it wasn't checked off, make sure it's checked off as a counter offer, because without that being checked, you're agreeing to provide the property free and clear of anybody else in possession. And when there's a tenant on the property, estoppel letters are required, but they are giving an exception to that rule when it's a short-term or vacation rental, and there's a specific rider for that. Another change here, assignability. Assignability allows a buyer to assign the contract that they have with the seller to another person, or to add somebody, or to put it into a holding company or to their trust. There wasn't a default previously. There is now. The default is the buyer may not assign this contract, because what was happening, it wasn't checked off. Realtors were forgetting to check it off. And then we had an ineffective contract. So if no box checked, then the buyer may not assign. Make sure, I would say the default that you should be using is may assign but not be released. This way we could add a borrower. This way we could add an owner. This way we could add the spouse. This way your investor can make sure they assign it to their holding company, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, gives the buyer flexibility. I'm going to touch briefly on pre and post closing occupancy. This is a whole other discussion, but right nowadays, pre-closing occupancy, letting the buyer in the property before the closing, I've seen it happen, And it usually causes a big disaster, to be honest, because if there's a delay in closing, then you have a very upset seller. And then what if it doesn't close? Then you have to evict, or it's actually not even an eviction, it's an ejectment action. So you want to make sure that if you avoid this as by all means possible, and don't really suggest this to your seller if it's your listing, as an option. Okay, I would say, because then if there's a problem, then you're the one that suggested it. Post-closing occupancies, where a seller stays after closing, this is more and more common nowadays due to the market, and due to the seller having more negotiating power. So it's a good option if it's your seller and they're trying to sell and buy the same day. This allows them a few days to move out and into the new place, and not having to move out and move in the same day, because that never is a good idea, because it's always the files that get a delay. It's when the stuff's on the truck is when there's a problem in the file. It's like real estate karma. Okay, so if there is a tenant on the property, you're gonna probably hear of a tenant estoppel. A tenant estoppel is required for by the contract to be obtained. It's saying the seller collected this much rent, collected this much deposit, for me, this last month's security, et cetera, on the lease. It's confirming there's no violations from the landlord or the tenant side. And it gives us the information we need to prepare the closing statements for the set-offs, prorations on rent, et cetera. Usually the agents are in touch with the tenant because they're the ones doing the showings, allowing access. So usually the agents are helping to coordinate that with the tenant. Okay, this is a very, very big change and a very, very important part of the contract that I need you guys to listen up to and understand. It's the financing section of the contract. It has been changed. There's been a lot of changes. I'll walk you through them step by step. Just know they took a lot of the fluff out of the cash deal. Okay, but what it really means is that there's no financing contingency. This does not mean that there won't be a loan. We're working on 2 files right now that had cash transaction checked off, but there is a loan. They're not being tricky. They're just saying, I'm willing to risk my escrow if I don't close. That's really what that means. Okay, so that's that. So if you really want to make sure it's a cash deal and not a borrower who's just trying to waive their financing contingency, you need to ask for proof of funds to see that money in the account. This next section. Basically, loan approval now means that the traditional way of loan approval as it did before, right? So there's 30 days to get loan approval, but loan approval means that the appraisal has been done and it is sufficient for the lender to close. So your appraisal must be done before the loan approval time expires. This is huge change because what usually is happening at the last minute, we're waiting on the appraisal. That can't happen anymore because your buyer will waive their financing contingency if that happens. So you need to make sure your lenders are ordering the appraisals as early as possible, because they're very backed up nowadays. So you get to the 28th, 29th day, if we had the default of 30-day loan approval, and what happens? You need to ask for an extension if you don't have your appraisal in yet, because otherwise you're gonna have a hard time getting your deposit back if that's the case. So let's talk about that. What happens? So you have 30 days to get loan approval. Loan approval includes appraisal, right? From there, the buyer has to make good faith and diligent effort to obtain the loan and get the appraisal, which means pay for it on time, which means make sure your lender orders it on time, right? Because not all lenders are created equal. Most lenders do not order or prepay appraisals. The buyer has to pay it. Most buyers don't want to pay it if they haven't passed inspection and know that it's going to go through. So just make sure you get, boom, your inspection done, get that out of the way, and tell your buyers, pay it as soon as possible, because we need to make sure it gets done early. Sellers have the right to get information now, but they have to do it up with a written request. So the seller listing agent can ask the lender to be updated about the loan process. You should be doing that anyways, because if there's a problem, the communication lines are already open. So this is the change. Buyer shall, upon written request, keep seller and broker fully informed about the status of the loan. Okay. And the appraisal, the loan approval, including any properly related conditions of the loan approval. We'll get more into that later. And this is automatically giving the lender, the closing agent, authority to disclose where we stand on the transaction. This is important because just 2 days ago, a buyer's agent was upset with the lender for giving away certain information, but by contract, they are required to disclose it and they have been given authority to disclose it. So that's not appropriate reaction to this scenario. So take it, if you're the listing agent, if you represent sellers, take advantage of this. Make sure you know what's going on in your deal. Make sure that the deal is moving forward and timely. Don't rely on the buyer's agent to give you information if it's your listing, because they're not all created equal. And they if your borrower gets denied, make sure that they get a copy of that declination letter. Because what happens? If within the loan approval, buyer obtains the loan approval, buyer shall, this is new, shall notify the seller of the same in writing prior to the expiration. Shall. We'll talk about what happens if they don't. The buyer shall notify the seller if they didn't get it and still want to proceed. Without loan approval, I'm willing to take my chances. I want to proceed. I don't have it yet, but I'm confident I will close. Now, what happens if the buyer doesn't give notice? If buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within that period, or cannot timely meet the terms of the loan approval after they receive those terms, and they've exercised good faith and vigilant effort, buyer may terminate the contract by delivering written notice of termination to the seller prior to expiration of the loan approval period. So what does that mean? Nothing's changed really here, except previously you had an out for the appraisal. Now you don't have that out anymore. The biggest change here, if buyer fails to timely deliver written notice to seller prior to the expiration, then buyer shall proceed forward with this contract as though 8A has been selected, as though it's a cash deal. So as the buyer's agent, you don't tell the listing agent in writing, and how in writing is going to be defined later, that your borrower has their loan approval. You are helping your buyer waive their loan contingency. Now, does the buyer know to explain this to the seller? Does the buyer have communication with the seller side? Not really. So it's really up to the buyer's agent. And if there's a buyer's attorney, the buyer's attorney to communicate this. Super, super, super important. Okay. So if no notice to seller means it's waived, even if loan approval was obtained. No notice, this is the kicker here, means the seller has the right to cancel within 3 days of the expiration. So let's say yesterday the loan approval period expired and no notice was given whether it was approved or denied. Buyer waives their contingency. Seller has today, tomorrow, and we'll say today, Wednesday, and Friday to say, hey, buyer, I don't want your offer anymore. I found somebody else I want to move with. And nowadays, if you're a listing agent and you know about this rule, you could use this to your seller's benefit, especially if you lose confidence in that buyer. Because if you have a buyer's agent and a lender that's not communicating properly, and you come through with a cash buyer or a buyer with a lending, a pre-approval letter or a DU that comes from a reputable source that you know can get things closed, right? From someone that you've seen close deals before, well, then at that scenario, a seller is going to walk. So that's why it's important to have good rapport with the other side, good communication. And if you're a listing agent, sometimes this might be your seller's way out that you're wanting. They could cancel, they can get another offer that they want, or they could pick up that backup offer if you had one. Okay. Okay, so here's the next section of what happens if loan approval was obtained but does not close. What happens? What happens if that loan approval comes through, there's a list of conditions, and something is not able to be done or completed, and then we get to the closing day and we can't close? What happens? Well, it depends why, but the general rule is buyer loses the deposit. So it's super important to understand what loan approval means. Loan approval is not defined. What loan approval is not a clear to close, we can tell because they would say that, right? But if I represent a buyer, I want as little conditions as possible in that conditional approval, because what comes through is not a loan approval. They're sending you a conditional approval. That's what the lender is sending you. The conditional approval says, I'm going to give you this loan, but you have to do these things as well. And we have to verify these things as well. Okay. So what does that mean now? That means you really need to talk to your buyer and say, look at these conditions. Are these doable? Let's make sure we're good. What I will say is that, so let's go through this clause again here, and then I'll elaborate a little bit further. If buyer has timely provided written notice and thereafter fails to close, the deposit shall be paid to the seller unless, and let's talk these through, seller defaults, of course, right? If seller can't close, then it is what it is, right? Or property related conditions of the loan approval have not been met. What does property related condition mean? We know it does not mean appraisal anymore. It used to, does not. So because it's part of the loan approval, you need to have appraisal already in, but it's not defined. So property related condition can definitely be something like termite issues on a VA loan. We know you can't have property related condition, you can't have termite issues to close a VA loan. That's a perfect example. That's a simple, clear example. But what is not a clear example is if those property related conditions are regarding the condo budget, the condo litigation, the condo maintenance and issues, the condo assessment, the condo anything. You could argue either way. It's not defined. I've certainly seen condo related issues stop a closing before when the borrower was approved. We see it quite often. So even if there's 25% down, there's been so many changes to condo regulations right now. We have to be very careful what those conditions are. So with that being said, if you are a buyer's agent and the condo project has not been approved during the loan approval period, you must get an extension, because otherwise you are risking your borrower's escrow. If there's anything on that conditional approval that talks about the condo project, budget, assessments, let's see what else about the condo, litigation, insurance, right? There's certain requirements in all these categories for the different loan types. And if that's not sufficient, or the lender did not get what they need to make the decision, you need to extend that, because what's going to happen is you're risking your buyer's escrow. And then even if this deal won't work out because this building doesn't work, doesn't mean that they can't go to a different property, to a different building and buy somewhere else. But if you lose their deposit, there's a very good chance they don't have escrow lying around to just lose. Even if they do, they won't be happy with you no matter what, whether it's your fault or not. They're not going to be happy that their deal, that they lost their escrow. So I like to take the most conservative approach when it comes to the condo related projects. And if there's anything in there other than a credit refresh and employer verification within a certain amount of time before closing, you need to be very careful about those conditions there, and make the buyer make the decision if they want to proceed or not with those conditions. All right, that was a lot. I need to drink some water because that was a lot of talking. Give me a second. So we said in a hot market, sellers may reject offers subject to financing, right? But doesn't mean they can't get, that doesn't mean that they can't still get a loan with a cash offer, right? There's just means there's no financing contingency. Make sure to request an extension to the loan approval in writing. So this is how I do it when I represent a party, okay? Listing agent, today is the last day or tomorrow is the last day for my buyer's loan approval. We just need a little bit more time to address ABC things. Should your seller, we are very confident that this is gonna right? This is gonna close. We just need a little bit more time to wrap up the details. The condo association was taking too long. The IRS took a little extra. They're backed up, whatever the issue is, right? Then we say, now, here is the extension addendum, extending the loan approval period till this specific date. Should the seller not agree to the loan approval period, here's my cancellation, my request to cancel the offer in an effort to protect my client's deposit. Please note, this is just a formality. We want to close this deal, but I need to protect my client's deposit. So you got to present it in that way so they don't get shocked by that release and cancellation. But you really should be doing it that way, because if you don't submit that at the same time and they just let the day pass without signing that extension, you are risking the deposit. I've seen nowadays for sellers to extend contracts, they're asking for the buyer's escrow to be released. It's an option if you have a seller that's not budging and you know your buyer's in default anyways. You could use that as a negotiating tool if you truly just need a little bit more time. Closing costs. All right, we've moved on from loans, that we're moving to closing costs. We're going to break this down into two parts. First, I want to compare the standard with the as is. This is a screen clip or a screenshot of the two different sections. What you will see here is in line 144 to 138 of the standard contract. That's the first one that's here. There is 3 line items there to be added, and there's a default there of 1.5% of the contract price. For automatic seller repairs, for general repair items that are in the inspection report, for WDO treatment, that's termites, and for costs associated with closing out open or expired building permits and obtaining required building permits for any existing improvements. This requires seller to make repairs. It's built into the contract. This also requires buyer that just can't back out because they don't like the inspection report. We'll talk more about that later, but that's actually a built into the closing cost section. Okay. Whereas in the as is, it's not there. All that there is a requirement to maintain the property and a suggested holdback amount of 125% of the estimated costs if there's an issue at walkthrough. Okay. Now let's get into nitty gritty. I get this question all the time, and this is some of the questions that I saw in the thread. So who pays for what, right? What's the difference between these 3 options? We have seller chooses and pays, we have buyer chooses and pays, and we have the Miami-Dade Broward regional provision, which is what we do here most often than not. Seller chooses and pays means seller pays all the searches and seller pays the owner's title insurance policy. This is the most common option for the rest of the state. Okay, Palm Beach, West Coast, Tampa, Orlando, etc. Second option, buyer shall designate closing agent and pay for owner's policy. Buyer chooses and pays. Buyer pays for owner's policy. Buyer pays for searches. Okay, buyer pays for all of it. Miami-Dade Broward regional provision is seller pays for searches. And when I say searches, we're talking about lien search and title search. And buyer pays for the owner's title insurance policy. What's the difference between 2 and 3 in terms of dollar figures is about $500. So as a buyer's agent, if you check off 3 and your listing agent comes back and crosses that off and checks off 2, your buyer is going to ask, which I see all the time, especially nowadays, your buyer is going to ask you, what is the difference? What does that mean? That means about $500 in search fees. Okay. Any questions on this part? Because I know I think I answered the ones that are there, but any questions on this? Let me review. Okay, let me go one more time. The first option, seller chooses and pays, means seller pays for owner's title insurance policy and the title search and the lien search. The second option, buyer chooses and pays, which means buyer chooses. When I say buyer chooses and pays or seller chooses and pays, choosing means they're the ones who hire the closing agent. They're the ones who hire the title company to do the closing. So if you choose, you pay. So in the previous question from earlier in the class, the seller's trying to make me use their title company. Sure, but then they got to pay. That's your comeback when that happens. You want to choose? Sure, you got to pay. Now, that might be a negotiating tool to pick one offer over the other, but that's the comeback that I would do. It's really, that's what I do. And when you say it like that, like, does a seller want to pay for title insurance premium? And there you go. Usually they say no. And then usually they stop insisting. Okay. Now, unless the contract specifically says buyer is the closing agent shall be such and such a company, there is no real requirement just because you have the escrow agent there. Remember, we spoke about the escrow agent being listed. The seller can put their own escrow agent. It doesn't matter as long as the closing, as long as if it's buyer chooses and pays, or the Miami-Dade Broward where buyer is choosing, they can't force the buyer to use the seller's company. As a buyer, what's the con if a seller chooses? I'll tell you what the con is. You don't know who they are. Just like not all realtors are created equal, not all closing agents are created equal. I'm sure you have a relationship. If you don't, I welcome a relationship with our company, but I'll tell you this, you want to be able to pick up the phone and know what's going on in your deal. You want to make sure things are happening on time. I don't know that title company. I don't know who they are and how they're going to service my deal. So why would I choose someone that I don't know especially if they're not going to pay for it, right? That's where the crux is. You do not need to write that into the contract. You just check off the appropriate box. Okay. So in the case where the seller wants to use a title company for seller's docs, what's the difference? We'll get into that. So recapping, seller chooses and pays, seller pays for the searches and the premium. Buyer chooses and pays, buyer pays for the searches and the buyer's premium, owner's premium. Miami-Dade Broward regional provision is a split. The sellers pay the searches, the buyers pay the owner's premium for title insurance. It's a $500 difference. That's how much the searches generally cost for a seller. That's the difference between the buyer choosing and paying and the buyer choosing Miami-Dade Broward regional position, because the Miami-Dade Broward is where the sellers pay the searches. So if seller wants to choose title, that's different from a seller wanting to choose escrow agent. Correct. They are different roles and different people. All right, guys, we got to move through this because we have more to cover. What sellers always pay, no matter what closing cost is there, they always pay doc stamps, they always pay estoppel fees, they always pay things to clear title. They pay FERPTA withholding and reporting costs, and they pay their own attorney's fees or their doc prep. Do not refer your sellers in Miami-Dade and Broward to a title company not doing the closing. It's unauthorized practice of law. Either the title company doing the closing does the docs, or a lawyer does the docs. One or the other. It can't. You can't take a unrelated title company to do docs. By law, a title company can only draft documents for a closing that they're issuing title insurance policy on. Don't be the agent that referred your seller to someone that is doing the unauthorized practice of law. There's a problem later. It's you that referred them. Okay. So that's the standard seller cost. Standard buyer's cost. Buyers always pay loan fees, of course, doc stamps on the mortgage, the survey, buyer's attorney's fees, inspection fees, appraisal fees, right? All the other, and lender title insurance policy, regardless of who pays the owner. Okay. Moving along. If the seller has a title insurance policy from when they purchased, you need to, I'm going to mute you, Kevin, here. You're creating interference. Sellers are required to provide their title insurance policy within 5 days of the effective date. And then the title commitment is 15 days before closing. Okay. You're required to have a commitment. So if the buyer chooses, their title company is going to give it to them when it's ready. The seller is choosing, they need to give it 15 days before closing at least. Survey is not required on a cash deal, but highly recommended. A survey on a loan deal is required. Don't let the lender bamboozle you, especially if they're a national lender saying, I don't need a survey. They do need a survey because they want a title insurance policy without an exception. This creates confusion to the buyers. So just know that so you can guide your buyers to say, yes, you do need a survey. It's required to be received at least 5 days prior to closing. I'm gonna go through this. Please keep in mind, surveys and lien searches are taking longer than normal right now due to the volume of closings that we have. You want these to be ordered as soon as possible to make sure you don't delay closing. That's why who you choose as a closing agent is super important. Special assessments. I'm going to run through this, guys, because we don't have too much more time. Special assessments are in the contract. Are not talking about condo special assessments. These are for, oh, I'm getting feedback here. Who's that?
I'll find it.
Okay, thanks. Condo special assessments are in the condo rider. These are city governmental body special assessments. The change is clarifying that most of these are on the tax bill. Because they're on the tax bill, they cannot be prepaid. So even though it's selected that seller has to pay in full prior to or at the time of closing, if it's not possible, seller, because it's not allowed to be prepaid, buyer will take over the assessment. Seller's disclosure, there's different disclosure requirements. In the as is, the extra disclosure, the seller has to state that they have not received notice of code violations and disclaims any warranties. Okay, that's a difference. Property maintenance, as is and the standard are the same, except in the standard, there are required repairs. Inspection period in the as is only has a certain time frame and buyer can cancel for any reason. Whereas in the other standard contract, they cannot cancel for any reason. The sellers were going to be required to make repairs. Okay. So I'm going to keep it as that simple right now because we don't have time to go into more than that. But what happens is the buyer does an inspection. The buyer says, I want you to make these repairs. You're required to make repairs up until these dollar figures from the closing cost section that we have in the property, in the contract. The seller says, I don't agree with your inspection. It's BS. Those aren't really there. You guys didn't use the right inspection company. Let me hire my inspection company. I'll do an inspection. Let's see. If they came out differently and buyer seller don't agree, buyer and seller hire a third inspection company together to do the final say. And then that's going to be the determining factor of what those repairs are. It can get a little bit complex, which is probably why people don't use this contract very often. Where I see this contract working in well is where you have properties that have a lot of little issues and that the deals keep canceling due to property issues. That's where I will say it's maybe a good idea as a listing agent to require the standard contract on the MLS. Okay. Permit disclosures. This was a change. It just basically updated based on the new law that says that the local law enforcement may close out a building permit 6 years after the issuance of a permit. So in general, in the as-is contract, sellers are not required to close out permits. It's an extra clause if you want that to be added and to be done by the seller. However, it is easier now to close out expired permits due to this new law that came into place. What happens if buyer defaults? Seller gets the money or can do, sue for liquidated damages, et cetera, et cetera. This is a whole other class. If seller defaults, say the buyer gets their deposit back, they can sue for breach of contract. And one of the recoveries for when you sue a seller is specific performance. Specific performance is forcing the sale by court order. So be careful with your buyers who want to back out, your sellers, excuse me, who want to back out of the contract for no reason. If you have one of those buyers that don't care about spending money on an attorney, they could sue for specific performance and force the sale. So just know that that's impossible. We spoke about FERPTA. That's for foreign sellers. Don't wait until closing to let the closing agent know your seller's foreign. It's all about intake, association approval. Most condos require buyer approval, HOAs. It's hit or miss, depends. So make sure you know if it's your listing that you communicate that. And just nowadays, they used to require in-person interviews, but now they've gotten much more flexible on in-person interviews due after the COVID, but just being aware of what their rules and requirements are for the approval. Don't come to closing with your buyer and say, oh, where's your approval letter? I don't know. I didn't know I had to apply. I've seen it happen before. Condos, pretty much 95% of condos have approval requirement. Remember we talked about all the notices that have to be given between buyer and seller? Well, they've clarified how notice can be done. It's by mail, facsimile, personal delivery, or email. Text will not be considered a method of service. So do not think your text to the listing agent will be enough for that. Additional terms, there's nothing here. That's how it should be. You're not a lawyer. Don't write crazy terms that no one else understands afterwards. If there's no meaning of the minds, that's another way to get out of the contract. But more importantly, that's the unauthorized practice of law. So if you're a listing agent and you want to mark up or scratch off sections of the contract for your buyer, don't do it. Don't do it because that's the unauthorized practice of law. You're only allowed to fill in blanks. That's why you hire a seller's attorney to do docs, and then they could help you with the offers. This part was changed to the back. There was a counter offer section that was scratched off because no one was using that, where the seller rejects the buyer's offer. You see line 655. So now 651 said, if you're going to counter offer, just check off that box. There's two new riders as well, seasonal vacation rental rider and the pace disclosure. This has been reworked a little bit too and how it was before. This, if you check it off, you must provide it. You don't need a condo rider or an HOA rider. It's one or the other. If you're not sure, if you have a townhome, for example, if you're not sure, look at the short legal. If it has the word condo in it, that's how you know it is a condo. If it doesn't have the word condo, it's going to be an HOA. Here's a seasonal rider, an example. Take a look at it, pull it up, but it basically has the disclosures and says if seller has to pick up new, is permitted to have new short-term rentals or not after the effective date. The pace are loans on the property to make repairs. They are liens on title that need to be paid off at closing, and they are required to be disclosed. We spoke about the condo rider. The condo rider here, I want to draw your attention to section C, special assessments. If your seller is not listing the special assessments in that section, regardless of who is checked off on the box on C2, the seller is going to pay. So you must disclose anything that has been notified to the seller from the board. You'll see in section 3, if special assessments levied or pending exist as of the effective date and have not been disclosed above by the seller, then seller shall have the assessments paid in full. Your seller does not know what it says there. You got to tell them because they won't read it anyways. So be familiar. I know I answered a few questions throughout. We don't really have too much time for questions, guys, but I'll be available here. You guys can hit me up with questions afterwards. Here's my contact information. I have more classes coming up. You could always find me on Instagram with my classes, with damage control, our show. Here's my contact information if you have questions after today, because we are out for time. And I think that's about it.
All right. So I'm sure you have many closings to attend. Thank you so much for your time, Melinda. I will be sending the recording probably next week, if you need to refer back to any of this. And
Excellent.
in the meantime, I will also do my best to include Melinda's contact information. And Melinda, I'll be sending you the RSVP list for this class.
Excellent. I have a
feel free
cheat
to
sheet.
yourself.
I have a cheat sheet for all the changes that I'm happy to share with everybody that was on the class today. So if you send me that list, I will send everybody that cheat sheet. I do not give out slides, but you'll have the recording to review back. And my office is in Hollywood. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been my pleasure to educate you today. It's what I love to do. I hope I broke it down simple enough for you all. If there's something else, we had to go in really fast at the end because we're running out of time. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to be of service. It's what I love to do. Thank you so much.
Right. So I think the best option is Melinda, I'm going to send you the mailing list right now. She's going to send out the cheat sheet. And if you have any questions, that is the time to ask.
Exactly.
With
Thank you
that,
so much. That's a
good
wrap.
luck on contracts. It seems like a lot, but when you have the right team in your corner like Melinda, things go a lot more smoothly. So please consider her for your services. And as always, it is great to be a Miami Realtor. We wish you the best of luck in this week and the closing season, which is upon us. So go out there and be great, and we'll see you in the next class. Take care, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Give up on my way home, yeah. Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me? Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me? Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me? Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me? Give up on my way home, yeah. Give up on my way home, yeah. Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me? Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me? Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me? Wouldn't it be crazy? Oh, don't you still amaze me?